Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome to our special moral corruption crisis in America. We're going to talk to three guests today. The first is going to give us a classical view of virtue. So we're going to go back to ancient Rome, ancient Greece. Next guest is going to give us a biblical view, and we're also going to bring in our founding fathers. And then our third guest is going to bring it all together and talk about these virtues and how they've weaved themselves into our great virtuous American story. That's the plan, anyway. Let me start this. So on my radio show and here on the TV, we talk about art a lot, modern art in particular. Modern art is the embodiment of our postmodern culture. It's harder to see it's hard to see our aimless, nihilist culture. I mean, you can, right? You see it with the riots, you see it with fatherless children and all these other broken aspects of society. But if you really want to see the fruit, if you want to see it in the, like here it is, if you want to see the fruit of a culture that not only attacks beauty, but celebrates ugliness, you just look at modern art, and there it is. Modern art and ugly architecture, it's a visual and obvious manifestation of bad ideas and critical theory. And it happened in the 70s when this was presented as art, this urinal here, and that's art, and who are you to say it's not? That's when the whole thing totally went off the rails, right? You take something beautiful, right? I think the most beautiful work of art is Pieta, and I think the most beautiful building in the world is the Florence Cathedral. And you look at those, and you're like, oh, those are beautiful. And someone who's more artistically inclined can tell you exactly why, right? The Parthenon, for instance, it's the golden mean. It's a perfect 4:9 ratio. It's visually appealing to the brain. It's symmetrical in just the perfect way. That Parthenon came out of a very particular time of Greece. All right, Pericles is 400 BC. Pericles was the first citizen of Athens, the defender of democracy, giving power to the people. And part of that was celebrating the arts. And that led to a lot of art projects, including the Parthenon, which is a perfect and stunning engineering and artistic accomplishment. In a healthy and flourishing and morally sound society, you see beautiful art. A society that is sick and declining and morally and intellectually rotting produces modern art. Right? A society that is morally healthy creates great art. A society that is morally rotting produces modern art. Enter Trafalgar Square. Trafalgar Square in London. Beautiful big square. In the middle is this giant column of Horatio Nelson. He died at the Battle of Trafalgar, which is his British naval victory at the Napoleonic War in 1805. And the original plan actually was to put a full-scale replica of the Parthenon in the square, right? And they did that they thought about doing that because at that time in England, they thought that we're the next Athens, right? We're the rightful torchbearers for freedom, just like the Athenian democracy was. So that's why they wanted to put the Parthenon there, right? See the connection between art and ideas. But they went with this column instead. Now, there's 4 pedestals all around the square. And they have different statues on them, different beautiful statues. But one of them was supposed to have a statue of William IV, but they never finished it. So it's just empty. So what they do now is they have these modern artists put their own crap on this pedestal. They call it a plinth or something. And they put it up and it's beautiful. Like what? Look how different, look how stunning. Oh, it just captures the blah, 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 blah. That was nonsense. So here, the latest one was just unveiled the other day. We have a video of the unveiling. It's very exciting. Oh, I can't wait. Here it comes. Oh, it's so beautiful. Look at it. It's stunning. Oh, I can't wait to see it. Woo, hoo, hoo. Did you hear the person? Woo, hoo, hoo. That right there is a dollop of whipped cream with a cherry on top and a drone stuck on it. And on the other side is a big, giant fly. You can see the fly on the left-hand side. Okay, that's a rotting culture. Now, they do this on this column. You guys have the next picture? These are a bunch of other statues that they put up on this pedestal here. You can see they're all just ridiculous. And all of it, the intent, I want to be clear about this, the intent is the destruction of beauty, right? They say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. No, it's not. Beauty is objectively true. There's symmetry, order, balance, proportion, context. Don't give me any of this, oh, it's interpretive. It depends on the experience of the viewer, blah, blah. No, it's total nonsense. And way too many people have fallen for this idea that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Because if once you start saying that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, which people just say because it kind of rolls off the tongue and sounds nice, then you start thinking that truth is in the eye of the beholder. I think when people say that, I think what they're referring to is more like tastes or preferences, right? You can have a preference for something over the other. The example we've given before is the Capitol building or like a Japanese pagoda, right? You can have a preference over which you like more, but they're both objectively beautiful for objective reasons. But you can have a preference over one, but they're still beautiful, right? Modern artists, they think art is supposed to be ugly because they're supposed to challenge the idea of beauty. And art is anything that makes you feel. A 2-year-old having a tantrum makes me feel. Doesn't make it art. Art to make you feel. No. But what they try to do is they try to make you feel shock and disgust. And that's what the point of modern art is. Just ask Cardi B. Which, by the way, Cardi B, her new song, I've heard it described as educational, wholesome, and even flirty. Right? So all this modern art, it's meant to shock and disgust and destroy. Right? So do you see all these bad ideas that we have in society? Do you see them in modern art? Do you see the connection? Intentionally meant to destroy the concept of art, intentionally meant to destroy the concept of truth, the concept, therefore, of America, the concept of virtue. And in doing that, destroy even the thought that maybe we should search for what is good, beautiful, and true. So, coming up in this segment here, this hour, we're going to talk about the virtues of a healthy society, the virtues we should celebrate and the virtues that we should raise our children to live. It's all coming up next. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special moral corruption crisis in America. So I want to start off our conversation talking about the classical view of morality and virtue. And there's no better person to do that than the host of this new podcast called The Young Heretics. You have to listen to it. He's the assistant editor of the Claremont Review of Books and at the American Mind as well. And it, of course, is Spencer Clavin. Spencer, how are you, brother?
I'm doing very well, thanks. How about yourself?
Man, grateful for your voice and your podcast and what you're trying to do and what you are doing. It's fantastic, so please keep it up. So we got 12 minutes here to solve all the problems of the world here. So let's start with thumos. I think that's a really important classical idea that we kind of got to wrap our head around. So what is thumos?
Great, okay, sure. So broadly speaking, the ancients, Plato and Aristotle especially, so 5th century Athenian philosophy here we're talking, we're really, really interested in what is the soul. Yeah, we all know we have bodies, we walk around, we eat, we get hungry, we desire things, but we also know that we have something more than that. There's something beyond just this like flesh. And so they typically tended to divide it into 3 different things. And this is the tripartite soul, which just means soul with 3 parts. Yeah. So you've got the logos, which is this kind of rational faculty, which we all at least hope that we use to like make decisions and stuff. And you've got the just the sort of appetitive part, the part that desires things and wants, I get up in the morning and I'm hungry or I have to go to the bathroom or whatever, just these impulses. And typically we kind of stop there. I think these days we tend to think, well, I have my brain and I've got what I want and I kind of negotiate between those 2 things. But the thumos, which there's no good like English word for this idea, is this kind of middle part. And it's associated with things like righteous anger. Like we typically translate it as spiritedness, and it has a lot to do with like military courage, especially important in the ancient view for men, for men to have a well-developed and well-trained thumos. Because if you sit around and you think about virtue or you have these pure ideas about what ought to be, but you can't then actually put that into action. That's a lack of thumos. C.S. Lewis called it men without chests, and it lives in the kind of classical view in your chest. And it's this sense of being able to follow through on your moral intuitions.
And men who don't have it manifest it how?
Right. So this is a really great description of a pretty major problem that we see in a lot of our leadership at the moment, especially in the academies and the universities. People who are able to make extremely glib and elegant arguments for absolutely morally abhorrent things. And this is something that the ancients were also very up on. Aristotle who's of course the father of kind of standardized logic, who's not somebody that is, particularly devoted to emotion or whatever. But the ancients were also very clear that emotion doesn't, or rather logic doesn't just, solve all of the problems of the universe. You can reason your way, you can make a clever rhetorical argument for basically anything. And so people without thumos are able to say, well, great, if we deliver a baby and then need to perform an abortion, we make sure it's comfortable. That these kinds of very horrifying moral arguments you hear made in, that's Governor Ralph Northam, but there's any number of other people you could cite who have this very overdeveloped kind of rhetorical sense of how to fit words together, but no heart, no passion for the world, no sense of justice that gets them indignant when they see, the weak in trouble, and so that kind of thing.
Yes, so good. So did the ancients talk about developing a thumos, or how did one build a thumos?
Yeah, well, this is a funny aspect of just ancient virtue in general. I think that we get really uncomfortable with, but it's absolutely essential. The idea of developing your moral faculties as a young person was crucial to ancient education. And we now think, because we've been basically duped by the progressive movement into erasing the virtue and morality from our public school education and from our just general idea of how to raise a kid, we now think that education is all about the mind. It's all about teaching people ideas. But the ancients were very clear that when you want to raise a kid to do something right, you don't just have to tell them how to do it right. You also have to put them into practice. And so things like sports, right? Gymnastics was the kind of broad Greek term for it, but it includes like military training, how to hold a weapon, that sort of thing. That kind of training that's very hands-on, tactile, and gets your body in the habit of responding in certain ways is a much more kind of holistic education. And we kind of think that because we're rational beings, we should just be able to reason about these things in a pure abstract space. But actually, our whole selves are involved in being virtuous. And so now when we take kids and sit them down in a classroom for like hours on end and make them never move, again, especially for boys, it's really, really bad to kind of not give them that practiced, felt sense of what's right and wrong, to not take them out into the field and show them, athletic virtue and things like that.
So good. Okay, so all that being said, maybe we can run through a couple of these virtues that the ancients would want to develop in young boys. We'll just focus on that for now. So maybe what's one that comes to the top of your head?
Well, one that I think a word that we use all the time but have no idea what it means is justice. Ancients loved talking about justice. We love talking about justice, by which we typically mean this incredibly corrupted anti-American idea, which is equity, right? Equality of outcomes. And the true virtue of justice, the kind of ancient virtue of justice, is giving to each what he is due. The fancy Latin version of this is suum cuique. And that's the foundation, for example, of Plato's Republic. But then it kind of gets developed out by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics. This idea that, look, if I have performed a morally evil act, if I've murdered somebody, then justice is to punish me. And the only way that we can even talk about justice is if we have that idea of retribution, of getting what you deserve, or getting what you deserve, getting the honor that you deserve for a victory in battle, right? Our purple hearts exist to do these sorts of things. And one of the ways you can tell our society is a little sick is that we attribute virtues basically to social climbers or we attribute honor rather to social climbers rather than to people that are actually, doing what is right for the sake of what's right. Another good one is courage, right? Which in Greek literally translates to something like manliness, Andrea. This sense of fleeing from shame in battle and heading toward honor in battle. There were all these videos just recently coming out of DC, right? Of these people being hounded by BLM or Antifa and these kind of big mobs into, raising their fist in the Black Power sign. If you don't raise your fist, you get shouted down, accused of being an evil person, white supremacist, and so forth. And, what made those videos so stirring is that everybody who saw the people that refused, that would sit in front of this mob and just not do what they were told to do by a bunch of shouting people, those that we all recognized virtue and Andrea, courage in that, right? We have this natural connection to it. And when we see it, we know how good it is. But we've lost the ability, I think, to really inculcate it, to train it in our kids.
All right, I got a question about each of those. Can we go back to justice real quick?
Yeah.
How, and this is a whole conversation, but how has justice been perverted, or how would one define it today? If it's not giving to someone what they are due, how is it today?
Well, I think one important idea that you have to talk about in between, right, the ancient idea of virtue and our modern idea or mistaken idea of virtue, which is basically fairness, right? That everybody gets the same thing, which by the way isn't even fairness, but that's kind of the word that gets used, right? The idea that everybody should have the same outcome, basically. One kind of intermediary step between those two things is this idea of universal rights or human rights. And that's a modern invention. It's not an ancient idea, but it is, I believe, a beautiful and good idea consistent with the ancient idea of virtue. This notion that we have certain God-given inalienable rights. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, of course, are the ones that we enumerate in America, right? But very, very quickly, that gets perverted into this idea, not that the government should ensure that you're free to seek the things that you are able to by God's gift, right? God gives you the gift, for example, to pursue property, right? To have and hold the things that belong to you. But this idea then that everybody has a right to universal health care, right, is a great example. That's called a positive right, like the government has to give you something. And once that happens, once you get, once you consider yourself entitled to a gift from the government, there's no rational way to say, well, this far and no further, right? There's no rational way to say, well, the government needs to give you a baseline of healthcare, but it doesn't have to give you, transgender surgery or what have you. So that perversion from the kind of negative universal rights to the positive universal rights is how we get, I think, to our bad idea of fairness.
Really
or
good
equity.
point. So if you could finish the sentence, so if the proper definition is giving to someone what they are due based on their what? Actions?
Yeah, I mean, we tend to think about this in terms of based on their actions. And I think that that's probably the best way to talk about it in law. But you might say, for example, that somebody comes in for a job interview and you see that they have a ton of talents, right? They're really able to write very well, and they're eloquent, and they're well-spoken, and so forth. Some of those things aren't actually actions. Some of those things are just gifts, and there's no equity there. That somebody else might come in with none of those gifts and not be the right person for the job. And that's a good example of something that, the modern idea of fairness would say, well, we have to give everybody equal pay and equal jobs. But the capitalist idea, of course, is a just idea, which means
really
given this person's talents.
Let me cut you off. We got one more minute. Can you give me one more virtue? Let's end here with a nice 3. So we got justice, courage. You got one more in a minute?
Oh, sure. A great one is magnanimity, bigness of soul and heart. And that's another kind of that gets perverted into, you just owe everybody reparations. You have to give out all your money. If you've got something, you didn't build that, so you owe it to everybody. But magnanimity is having something and having a liberality of soul that would enable you to engage in things like actual charity, right? To choose. I don't have to give you this gift, but I do out of the goodness of my heart. That's true virtue, and you can't have it in, for example, a socialist state where you're considered to owe everything to everybody.
Magnanimity. What is it? What's the root of that word?
So magnum is the Latin word for big, and anima is the word for soul. So big souledness, this kind of expansiveness of heart and soul is magnanimity.
It's got to be more than generous, though, right? So take me there, because it's bigger than what I'm thinking. So I think generous, but what else is it?
Well, you might also be magnanimous in a situation where you've been wronged. And this has to do with forgiveness, right? You might also have such a big we talk about somebody being a big man, being the bigger man. And so admitting that you were wrong, admitting that other people have wronged you, but you're going to offer them forgiveness. That's an example of magnanimity. It has to do with this just expansiveness because you are so abundant in your soul that you don't need these petty forms of recognition, or you don't need, the $5 that you're going to, lend to this guy or whatever. So it goes all the way down to money, but it also goes all the way up to things like spiritual gifts of forgiveness.
Really good. All right, super introduction there, Spencer. Let's, can we do it again? Can we talk more about this? Can you be our go-to classics guy?
It would be my absolute pleasure. I'd love to.
Man, that's awesome. I want everyone to go listen to the podcast and leave a 5-star review. Young Heretics and Spencer Klavan on Twitter. Spencer, great to talk to you, brother. Let's do it again.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks, man. What an awesome intro. What a great start. Justice, courage, magnanimity. Okay, let's move to some biblical virtues and America's founding fathers' virtues coming up with our next guest. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special moral corruption crisis in America. Just got done talking with Spencer Klavan about this classical view of virtue, and let's talk about justice, courage, and magnanimity. And now I want to go to Professor Matthew Spalding. He's the Dean of the Graduate School at Hillsdale College in Washington, D.C., and he wrote a while back the book, We Still Hold These Truths, Rediscovering Our Principles and Reclaiming Our Future. Professor, how are you, sir?
I'm fine. How are you? Great to be with you.
Wonderful to talk to you. So let's start with our founding fathers. So obviously they knew that virtue was essential to this country, could not exist without it. Maybe we can run through a couple of those. Well, maybe why did they think that would be the first question. And then maybe we could run through a couple of those virtues.
No, absolutely. I think one of the great misunderstandings about the American founding was that it emphasized questions of liberty and free government, which we will generally acknowledge, but that they didn't quite realize the extent to which that absolutely turned upon, indeed necessitated, a virtuous citizenry behind it. The whole concept of free government, as far as they're concerned, was not free, you can do whatever you want and nothing matters. What it meant is you were free to make moral decisions. And so questions about character, about education, about moral upbringing, and about religious liberty, which is to say that rules and laws by which churches and religious education could thrive to form those kinds of citizens was actually central to the American founding and how they understood how this was going to work. And they also understood that if you didn't have that moral grounding of your citizenry, free government was not possible. It just simply was not possible. It wasn't historically. It had not proven to be possible, and they knew it could only be possible if you could have a virtuous citizenry. So they created a republic, as Ben Franklin once famously said, a republic if you can keep it. And the if you can keep it means we got work to do, and it's always an experiment to see whether it's possible, and that depends really on the virtue of the citizenry.
Love it. Let's roll through. Maybe we'll do like 3 here. What's one of the top virtues that our founders preached and wished that we had more of?
Well, I think that as a practical matter, probably the chief virtue they talked about was a just sense of self-control. We use the phrase self-government. The United States government is about self-governing. We're a self-governing people. But they meant that in 2 ways. We self-govern, but we are also self-governing. And so they really saw those as 2 sides of the same coin. So self-governing, governing of the self, which means basic ability to moderate one's passions, to not be violent, to obey the rule of law generally, the common things that we take for granted nowadays. Those were absolute necessities in free government. The question then becomes how you learn those. So we need to be self-governing, I would say would be the first one. And that then brings in the question about why you need religious institutions and free education, and why, as is true in almost every state of the union, the federal government has little to do with education. It should have none to do with education. But state governments and local governments education is centrally important, and education was always understood as a way to teach morality.
Self-control or self-governance, self-control, as opposed to what? What did our founders see in history, or were they wary of if we did not have that?
They talk at great length about the distinction between liberty and licentiousness. Liberty is an old Roman word, and actually means that liberty appropriate for a human person. And human persons were not animals. And so liberty meant ordered liberty. You have the rule of law in order to have that order. But then beyond that, you have to learn to be a human being, which is why you need churches and religion and education and what we today would call the liberal arts to liberalize us. Licentiousness, on the other hand, means to act like an animal. It's all liberty is merely license to do whatever you want, to take what you want, to get to make those claims, to follow your passions. The American founding really turns upon the broad classical distinction between will, which is to say we do whatever we want according to our will, which is what much of modern philosophy is about, and reason. And reason means using our minds, not merely as in an enlightenment sense, but reason the way that God created us, as in the laws of nature and nature's God. The greatest virtue of the founding, if you want to put it in those terms, was this relationship between reason and revelation, between philosophy and the revelatory traditions of the Judeo-Christian world. And that opened up this great possibility then of allowing churches and religion back into our politics. It was not a way to exclude them, but bring them back in so they can make free government possible.
Oh, good. Okay, let's bring the Bible in here. What would maybe be a biblical virtue? I mean, self-control is sort of like temperance, right? So that's one of the cardinal virtues. There's a connection there, obviously. But what would be a more specifically biblical virtue that our founders look towards?
Well, I would put the broadest terms. I think the American founders absolutely understood that American civic virtue really depended upon a recognition and a larger kind of activity in recognizing the existence of a higher being, of God, of a creator God, a God who was involved in human affairs, a God of providence. It's hard to read the Declaration of Independence and see that is not clearly there and absolutely necessary. In the ancient world, it's called the great chain of being. On the one hand, man must know he's not an animal and act like an animal. But on the other hand, he knows he's not a God, and there is a God, and there's a higher God. And broadly speaking, that was understood to be a biblical God, a Christian God. It's sometimes hard to find a specific reference. I mean, obviously, there's lots of references to Christianity and references to Christ, but the American founding itself was not technically Christian in that sense. It's not based on biblical truths, at least in the technical legal sense. But it is throughout based on a broad recognition of those truths, because that was the essence of what our culture was, what our civilization was built upon. And they broadly thought that there was a overlap between biblical truths and the virtues of the Bible and the great traditions of philosophy and history that came from the rule of law and British constitutionalism. They really saw those things as not at all incompatible. And that's what's often missed when we think of the founding. We think the founding was a bunch of Enlightenment deists that somehow didn't like religion. Well, that wasn't the case. That's not to say there were also a bunch of evangelicals merely doing this for the sake of religion, although some of them were, by all means. But they saw these things as melded together and not at all contradictory or incompatible with each other. Yeah. So generally speaking, the biblical virtues of moderating one's passions, of being faithful, of holding up contracts, which is being honest, being spirited, defending your liberty, defending your family. All those, they would say were virtues, and all those I would say are biblical virtues.
Yeah, that's right. Let me ask you this. So one of your chapters in your book, which everyone has to read, we still hold these truths. The virtues of self-government, building community, forming character, making citizens. Such an interesting idea, the idea of making a citizen. And you're not just a citizen. I mean, you are a citizen, right? But there's a process of making. So in 2 minutes, how does one go about making a citizen? What does that process look like? Did it and should it? And then I guess we've been answering here too, we're touching around obviously, but what is one of those characteristics of a citizen as opposed to a subject, which I guess would be the opposite?
No, well, that distinction is probably the most important, the difference between a subject and a citizen. Throughout all history prior to the American founding, we were at best subjects, subject to a king or a dictator. The American founding is different. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. We are equal before God. We are equal before the law. But that doesn't make us citizens. We have to choose to be a citizen. That's what it means to be self-governing. And you merely are not become a citizen by birth, although birth has something to do with it, but through educating, being raised. Part of that is learning the civic truths, as in when immigrants take a test. That's part of civic education, which is part of becoming a citizen. But for the American founders, part of becoming a citizen is being shaped by other citizens. That is your parents, your neighbors, people around you. You learn how courts work. You learn about the rule of law. You learn by reading newspapers. You learn by growing up and seeing how America works, seeing how business operates and how you keep contracts. That's part of becoming a citizen too. So the point is it doesn't happen on its own. We have to choose it. We have to choose to be self-governing and maintain our self-governance. And that's what they mean by making citizens. It's a constant test. And you don't do it and it's all over again. We're always trying to be citizens and do our civic duty.
Love it. I hate we have to stop there, Mr. Spalding, but it's wonderful to talk to you. We still hold these truths. Everyone go by it. Rediscovering our principles, reclaiming our future. And please give my best to everyone at Hillsdale. You guys are just doing an incredible service. I'm so grateful for Hillsdale College. It gives me hope. My kids are little, but
Great.
I hope one
thank
day
you.
they can go to Hillsdale.
We're always there and we'll be there forever, so make sure they apply.
Yeah, they will. Thanks, Professor. Have a great day.
All right, bye-bye.
Appreciate you. All right, coming up next, we'll talk to actually someone who, Professor McClay, who has a course at Hillsdale. It's a free course that you can take about America. So we'll talk with him coming up next. Mike Slater, spread the word. Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special moral corruption crisis in America. So we've talked about classical views of morality and virtue. We've talked about biblical views of morality and virtue. And now I want to tie it all together with Professor Wilfred McClay from the University of Oklahoma. He's got a textbook out. It's specifically targeted towards high school kids who are taking the AP History exam, but it's for everybody, right? So your kids go to a charter school or a private school or a home school, please check this book out. And it's for adults too. Read it. It's called Land of Hope, an invitation to the great American story. And certainly for everybody, he did a course at Hillsdale College that is free, open to everybody. These Hillsdale courses are wonderful. It's called The Great American Story, A Land of Hope. Professor, how are you, sir?
I'm fine. It's great to be with you. We've been trying to set this up for a while, so I'm glad we finally did.
No, thank you. So let me start this. So why is story important? Why are narratives important?
Well, I think because their narratives are the way that that moral knowledge, moral principles become real to us. We see action, whether we're telling a story of something that actually happened or a narrative that's fictional. But nevertheless, to see, just for example, to see a hero, a George Washington, just to pick a random example, at Valley Forge, to see how a great heroic figure, a real heroic figure from the American past, endured all kinds of privation and difficulty in order to achieve what he achieved. And by the way, had a very strong sense of moral virtue, of the public necessity that a leader evince virtue, and that citizens of a democracy, of a republic, need to be virtuous in being involved in the civic life of their country. So anyway, the story, you can lay out a set of principles, nine secrets of of a happy populace or an effective leader, but it doesn't mean much unless you get a sense of how an actual flesh and blood leader moving through circumstances can make those principles actual, make them real. That's just one example. I mean, also to be to feel yourself part of a story, of a larger story, is to have a sense of belonging. I think a lot of young people grow up without that being provided to them anymore. There's a sense that history is fundamentally a work of moral critique of all the ways that our founders, of our predecessors, of everybody up to last week, fell short of the moral standards that we, in our advanced state of knowledge, have decided to impose upon them. And that's actually a poison pill of history if it's treated in that way, and that you don't come away from it with a sense that there is a past, an imperfect, flawed, often deplorable, sometimes glorious past that you are part of by virtue of being an American, and that you want to know about it. Just like, let me use a kind of homely analogy. Families. Families have stories. Actually, we often don't agree about the stories. That's part of the joy of family life. But especially large families, there is a sense, when you go to one of these large. I don't have a large family, but you go to one of these large family reunions. I have been to them, and you've got the people who are not really on speaking terms. You've got all of that going on, and yet there's something that's drawing them all together. What is it? It's the Smith family story. There's some sense that they are a part of. Everybody is a part of that, even if they can't abide somebody else who's a part of it. But to be part of a story, to be part of that narrative, that structure of meaning, is profoundly important to us as human beings.
And if we're going to live in a country of 330 million people, then we certainly better have some profound stories.
That's right, especially because we don't, let me just add, because we don't have a racial or ethnic bond of similarity drawing us together. We are and always have been, to some extent, a very diverse and polyglot, multiple faiths, and so on and so forth. So we've always been pluralistic. That's not a new thing. And so we have to have something larger than just the story of our ethnos, our group. We have to have something bigger than that. And that's what I'm modestly trying to provide. I hope.
And we need it so badly. Can you share with us one here? Just share with us a story that maybe we don't know, or we don't know the fullness of, that will give me and our listeners and my kids that sense of belonging. I've heard this phrase before, and I don't know if I read it. I read something of yours in the American Mind just the other day, actually before we booked this interview. And I don't know if it was you or someone else who talked about the unfolding drama. I like that concept. That's a nice visual, right? So connect me to this unfolding drama that can show a virtue that we have.
I don't know whether this is something that people don't know or not, but they probably don't, because they don't know much.
That's true.
I think, Lincoln is endlessly interesting and endlessly fruitful to study and to connect with. I think a lot of people don't realize how they may know that Lincoln was moody and suffered from melancholy and this kind of thing, but I don't think people realize how convinced Lincoln was in 1864 when, in the middle of a civil war, we were having an election. What a country. He was running for re-election and was opposed by George McClellan, who had been one of the many generals he fired because it wasn't performing the task. And that Lincoln was convinced. Lincoln was convinced, and not without reason, that he was going to lose the election. Imagine that. I mean, we take the outcome of the Civil War is an absolute given. Well, of course, the arc of history and all of that. Well, no, it was if we hadn't had the military victories of Grant and Sherman uh, before the election, it's very possible that the weariness of the public, the American public, and this is something we can identify with. We get tired of fighting, especially when they go on and on and on, as several late have done. We get tired of it. We're not really into war. So a lot of the public was losing faith. Was let's settle this thing. Let's get it over with. And so Lincoln, who at the outset of the Civil War, most everybody thought it was going to be a brief thing. Everybody knows the story about the people going out in their carriages with picnic lunches to watch the Battle of Bull Run, which became a rout for the Union. It should have been a sign things were not going to go so well or so easily. Everybody expected it to be a short run thing. By the time Lincoln gives the Gettysburg Address, it's no longer a short run thing, and he's tasked with trying to convey to the public, what does this all mean? All this sacrifice of blood and treasure, and he does. He gives a more exalted view of the war, a new birth of freedom and so on in the Gettysburg Address. But the point I want to make is that all of that came so close to being a complete waste. Because if McClellan had won the election, it would have, everything Lincoln had tried to accomplish would have gone up in smoke. And it was not a remote possibility. Lincoln himself believed he wouldn't be able to win the election because the public was just so weary of the war effort. And I think that's something when you see that in general, when you can. One of the things I try to do in Land of Hope is, instead of standing back and judging leaders, they're patched away as if I'm God and passing judgment on them, is to try to bring people inside the situation, into the situation room, so to speak.
Yeah.
What did Harry Truman have to sort out when he was trying to decide whether to use the atomic weapons to conclude the war in the Pacific? What kind of choices what kind of choices did Lincoln face with the South little by little seceding? How, and he, of course, one of the things he did was he maneuvered the South into firing the first shot, which is very important, morally speaking. And Lincoln appreciated that. But in general, I try to and I think the young really need this. That again, instead of having this sort of almost consumerist approach to politics and thinking, well, does this guy deliver on this checklist of things? No. See, how does it look to the leader? What does it feel like to be a leader? And
I think people hopefully will have some humility when they go into that situation room too, and think it's not as easy as it is to look back and judge on. Sir, I got about 2 minutes. Real quick on that point about how close history's been. I mean, I love stories like that. Just on Monday, we shared a story of George Washington crossing the Delaware, and how there were 3 different groups that went across the river, and 2 of them didn't even make it. So I mean, that it was an impossibility that he even made it across at all. And then what would have been different if that never even happened? Can you give me, sir,
the American Revolution is just phenomenal. I mean, it should never have been successful. I do try to convey some of this, and what a close run thing that was. There've been a lot of close run things.
We got about 2 minutes, sir. Can you give me one virtue or one point of morale? Let's focus on virtue. One virtue that you think, this is such a big question, but that defines the American ethos that you've seen woven throughout our history.
Well, I think this is going to seem like a cop-out, but my title, Land of Hope, is meant to convey something about us that I think is different. We're an aspirational people, and we always think that what we're born into is not the last word about us. And I'm not saying every single American thinks this, of course not, but I think that it as a controlling ethos, it's pretty profound. This sense that
Is that not normal? Is that not around the world? Is that not a normal human thing?
No, it's certainly not a characteristic of a culture. This is why people come here, because this is a place where you can. It's known that you can better your lot in life. It's silly things are said about. Well, people said the streets were paved with gold, and they weren't paved with gold. That's a silly argument. The question is, did Italian peasants, impoverished people from all over the world, Europe and Asia, come to this country and better their lot and that of their children? And overwhelmingly, the answer, yeah.
That's amazing. And that's another great example of something that I've just been swimming in this stew that is America. You take so many things for granted unless you realize, like even just that point of us being a hopeful person. It's like, oh, well, everyone's hopeful. No, not if you live in a country with no hope. Professor, we gotta run here, sir. I hate to cut you off, but I want people to continue this conversation by getting your book, especially if you're homeschooling or charter school or any public school and you just want the proper narrative. Land of Hope by Wilfred McClay. And then everyone, please watch the course too at Hillsdale College. And you can take the course for free.
May I mention one other thing? We also, for those homeschoolers, we have a teacher's guide. And
nice.
we've gotten rave reviews about it. It's fairly new. It just came out about a month ago. And
super.
So have a look at that. If you're unexpectedly teaching your kids at home,
that's right,
and you want to use Land of Hope, this teacher's guide's a big help. I'm just putting the last touches on a student workbook, which will go with Land of Hope and with the teacher's guide.
Beautiful.
So,
let's talk when that comes out. Professor, wonderful to talk to you, sir. Thank you so much.
Great to talk to you. Thank you.
Have a great day. So important to know our story, to know who we are, to have that sense of belonging. Beautiful. Mike Slater, spread the word. See you again.